So again, thank you for two very interesting, inspiring contributions. We shall try to find out if we have differences here amongst our speakers on various points. Where do we see convergence? And certainly maybe we can start with Marcia, Pali, on the question which took me just very clearly about the question of stereotypes. How stereotypes are one of the major hindrances on the way to a new cosmopolitan narrative, memory, or whatever. So maybe we can just have a word about stereotypes. I think I'm sure if I was being sociological and asked our public what information and what kind of images do you have about the evangelicals in the US, I don't think it would be too daring to say you had a rather different picture than the one that we have been presented today. So I think that just with your example, we have this with regard to very, very many different groups. We already talked this morning about the problem of having this kind of stereotype in the culture of fear put onto whole groups in the Muslim communities. So what about stereotypes?
Hello? Yes? I think this audience knows a great deal about stereotypes and their pernicious effect. In the case that of evangelicals whom I've been studying, we have a situation that frequently happens with stereotypes. One sector gets a very, very loud microphone, and then all people of that group are tarred with the brush of that one group. So suddenly all evangelicals come to about 80, 90 million people in the United States. Now, if you ask yourself, how likely is it that 90 million people are all going to have the exactly same opinion? Not very. And nonetheless, it's the case certainly in Europe and certainly in the United States, that most people have a stereotypical view of evangelicals as, I said, some kind of religio-political lemmings, all jumping off of the same right-wing cliff all of the time, and all for the same reason. What I tried to do in my research was to find out what was going on the ground. I am also dismayed at the amount of resistance that I've encountered to what is now 2005, 2013, 8, 9 years of field research and empirical research. Speaking to the tenacity of prejudice, whether that is against Jews or Muslims or evangelicals, that I simply have encountered a great deal of, well, people reacting, saying, well, I simply don't believe you. And then if I say, on the basis of what do you not believe me? Please tell me your research. I get an absence of an answer other than the repetition of the declaration that I must be wrong. But this is equivalent to saying all Jews are moneylenders or all Muslims are terrorists. All right, and all Germans are Nazis. We can go on forever. And this dismays me because the bet of the Enlightenment was that increased education would at least put a dent into prejudice and stereotype. Sometimes that's the case, and sometimes it is much more comfortable for emotional reasons for people to hang on to their beliefs than to the facts.
No, I can't comment about stereotypes towards evangelists because I don't know really much about them.
Generally. So
God, I mean,
just
it's
generally, because I think if we're looking for a more cosmopolitan
yes,
memory,
I mean, there's
stereotypes
there's stereotypes against cosmopolitans. There's stereotypes against nationalists. I mean, I think there's even a stereotype that we can outroot stereotypes, and I think they're like prejudice. They're part of what how human peoples act, feel, interact with others. There's this kind of if I can connect to what Marcia said about the Enlightenment, there's this kind of Enlightenment stereotype that education or Bildung can outroot stereotypes, which is, of course, one of the biggest stereotypes that the Enlightenment ever produced. So I wouldn't get so much worked up about stereotypes. I mean, we just have to live with them, and they will accompany us for the rest of our days, I think. There's really nothing that wrong with them. As long as they don't kill you, those stereotypes, you can live with them, I would say.
Can I be devil's advocate? I think we probably can agree that stereotypes, we have to live with them. To some extent. If we don't have one stereotype, then we shall develop new ones, because of course they are a way of reducing complexity, giving some kind of an orientation. We can hold on to them and don't have to think sometimes too much about more detailed information. So I would agree with you on that one. But stereotypes have the nasty potential of being politicized, and then of course becoming real hard prejudices which interrupt any kind of peacekeeping or transcultural conversation, sometimes when we don't expect such interruptions. And then that gets us back maybe to what we were trying to talk about this morning, about the real dilemmas that we have in maybe our new localities. So can I be devil's advocate? Can we just get out of it by saying, well, okay, they're there and we have to live with them?
I don't know any other way. I mean, Roland mentioned this morning the daily news, was it the Daily Mail, the Daily Mail, and we all know these newspapers. So what we can do, I mean, we can take the certain nice, distant, elite intellectual position and say "Pfui" about stereotypes. I mean, that's one way of dealing with it. But I mean, seriously, I mean, reduction of complexity. I mean, if I think about my lecture in Introduction to Sociology, I mean, I think that 80% of what I'm saying there is like reduction of complexity, and it's stereotypical, and it's like trying to find a frame. I mean, I don't see my mission in life to educate the masses to be without prejudice and stereotypes. It would be presumptuous. I mean, this is not a game I'm playing, and I don't think this is the game we should be playing here. And I mean, we have to make sure, and this is what I said before, that we're not going to be killed by those stereotypes. As long as we're not going to get killed by those stereotypes, I guess we have no other choice than to live with them. I'm insisting, I'm playing God's advocate in that sense.
On one hand, stereotypes are another way of saying culture. Every cultures have worldviews, and often they are wildly inaccurate, oversimplify in order to function. People walk around with all kinds of nonsense and categories in their head in order to function, and every individual doesn't fit the category. This we know. Edmund Burke called stereotypes useful prejudices. We cannot investigate everything every minute of every day to find out its true essence. Nobody functions that way. On the other hand, stereotypes are crippling because they prevent people from doing and being who they can be and what they are. And so while we can be chic and say that stereotype is part of culture and we have to live with them, I think we all know that where they are pernicious, I would say there's an ethical duty, playing God's advocate, to try to address them, expose them, and erode them in light of something called perhaps the way a person is rather than the way you think they ought to be based on whatever signal you're picking up on. This reminds me of a quip that George Maynard Keynes said when he was criticized in the Great Depression for changing one part of his economic theory, and he was criticized for being inconsistent, in other words, for changing his perception. And he said, "When the facts differ, I change my theory. What do you do, sir?"
Natan, maybe we can go into some of the things you've been saying. Perhaps we can pick on the question of cosmopolitism and the plurality of identities. You made a strong point about the concept of a unified identity being exposed or being put on sort of European set. But if we go back to the plurality of identities, is it not the point that we very often, of course, have identities which become virulent and also, of course, very effective in differing situations? Very often that we may have dormant identities, also historical identities. I'm looking at Roland Robertson, imagine the Scots now wanting to become independent after 300 years of being part of the UK, partly also because of images of identity and these things. So what is the conflict between identities in the plural and more having this sort of unified concept of developing what do we want to have as a global, cosmopolitan, human, whatever?
Yeah, it's, the Scots, yeah, we won't talk about the Scots here now. So, I mean, we can talk about the crazy Catalans even. I mean, it's like they're wanting their own state as well, and for no good reason whatsoever. But, and we can talk about my place forever when it comes to that. I think what's behind that is basically the temptation and the challenge of the concept of sovereignty, and the challenge and the temptation of the concept of sovereignty, which can be looked at individually and which can be looked at collectively. And there's this talking about stereotypes, there's this huge stereotype about individual sovereignty. And that stereotype of individual sovereignty was somehow translated into an even bigger stereotype of like collective sovereignty, of national sovereignty, of independence. And I mean, like I try to tell my students, only when your oppressor is coming from the same ethnic group you're coming from, you will be a free person, and if your oppressor is from a different ethnic group, you're an oppressed person, then you understand that whole concept of sovereignty, of independence, is rooted in one of the really biggest stereotypes we ever produced, which is the stereotype of autonomy and sovereignty. Personal one and collective one. You can start with Rousseau and you can move on to the romantics and to the nationalists and all that. What I want to do is take that concept of cosmopolitanism And I know it's a stereotype. I mean, you have told me so many times, even written about that. But I'm doing it consciously, sort of like using that stereotype of cosmopolitanism, which undermines the notion of autonomy, which undermines the notion of sovereignty, personal sovereignty, and as well as national sovereignty. Because if we want to look at that concept of cosmopolitanism as something which undermines the sovereignty, the concept of sovereignty of nations, we have also to start with the concept of the sovereignty of the individual, the autonomous individual, and to see that there is no such thing as an autonomous individual. There is no such thing as a sovereign individual. There is no such thing as a culture which is local, rooted, closed. I mean, that these are huge, huge stereotypes, and that the concept of culture, which anthropologists are now trying to sell us as something rooted, local, being threatened by globalization and all that, that this is like one of the biggest Western myths ever created. So if we succeed undermining these concepts and look at our individuality as something which is created socially, then we can also see that culture is something which is constantly created in interaction, through exchange and all that. And I'm doing this by looking at Jewish culture, which is for me like a master key to these processes.
Marcia, before I let you have a word, maybe I just continue a little bit to be devil's advocate. One of the debates we also have is the constitution of what is, we can maybe describe indeed as being parallel societies. We have a debate here, we have a debate in many areas. Is that not a contradiction to what you're saying?
I wouldn't get too much excited about that. So, I mean, this is like this whole what is called here in Germany Integrationsdebatte. This whole integration shtick. I mean, it's like why are people so obsessing about that people have to integrate into what exactly? Sort of like this is like talking up in the air about something which does not really exist. So Parallelgesellschaften is something that, what you're going to do, you're going to dissolve them by decree. You're going to declare a law that there is Parallelgesellschaften are going to be verboten from next week on. I mean, what you're going to do? I mean, this is how people organize themselves. And I think what you need is a certain kind of what you can call in German Gelassenheit, sort of like you can let go a little bit of like the kind of forced way of integration and all that. As long as you're not being killed by that, this is something which we all should try to live with.
Conversation and say, yeah, okay, then if we say not integrated, but do we have to have shared a certain set of shared values? Do we talk about the Menschenrechte? What are the Menschenrechte in human rights? Human rights. Is that a conversation instead of integration? I mean, because you are of course provocating as well. If we say parallel society, does that mean also those who do not advocate human rights? I mean, where is the...
As I said, as long as we
They might not kill us straight away, but
no,
maybe later.
Of course not. But, I mean, I think that you may... There are some common grounds, basically. And I also think that most people will agree of most points of that common ground, because most people just want to live and to be left alone, I believe. Sort of like what we heard before about the music and the underwear. And I think this is a much more important point than was earlier indicated. But of course, clear. I mean, this is a trick question, and you know it's a trick question. It's like, it reminds me of the old debates when you're refusing to go to the army, and then the person who was checking your conscience says, and if somebody comes and kills your sister, you're not going to draw a gun to show that your pacifism is not really 100% consequential. So I know what you're doing. I mean, it's a trick question, and I'm not going to say, you know, I'm propagating here, let 1,000 flowers bloom, even if these flowers are poisonous and they're going to kill me. So I'm not. This is of course impossible. But what I'm saying is that it is possible that people can live humanly. And I think there's a way that this kind of humanness is a very broad, can be broadened to the most extreme point. The vulnerable body, pain, suffering, hunger. These are things that can be agreed upon. You know, that you don't have to be a radical Kantian universalist to say that people should die of hunger, that torture is all right, and all these things. I mean, this is not. What I'm not trying is to advocate some kind of like blind multiculturalism, but what I'm trying to advocate is a reduction of sovereignty and a way of like looking at culture in a different way.
Marcia.
Well, there's a few ideas there. I believe that you asked us how to solve all the problems of the world for the future forevermore through cosmopolitanism. That was the original question, wasn't it? I think we have to distinguish, first of all, between stereotype and prejudice, which are not identical. And as I said earlier, prejudices can be terribly crippling. I'm not sure that we can blithely say that we can assume a universal agreement on Menschenrecht or on torture. We don't have a universal agreement on torture. We have a vigorous debate in my country, and we certainly have debates internationally. I'm not optimistic about an easy collection of cosmopolitan human values that everybody's going to agree on. I don't see empirical evidence for that. Which means that we also have to be very realistic about where the real conflicts are. If you get a bunch of Western Europeans and happy Canadians together, they're going to agree on human rights, more or less. But if you want to include the rest of the world, you're going to have vigorous debate. And those are serious debates, and they're debates people who are willing to take up arms about. And we have to be realistic about that. So if we are going to defend what we call Western notions of human rights, more or less, if we can come up with some kind of basket, I think we have to be realistic that we will have to defend them, and that we had better have some robust and sturdy and enduring reason for preserving them. Otherwise, we will be unconvincing and unable to defend them whenever, under what circumstances they are attacked. I wanted to raise, to your cosmopolitan question, or to your what do we do about the future forevermore through cosmopolitanism. I agree that the concept of the autonomous individual, or what I call the separable individual, separable from tradition, land, feudal bonds, et cetera, is a construct of Western modernity. But like Latour, I also think that it is a concept that we can't do without in our Western societies, and that it is in a productive meld or mixture with the notion of the situated individual, the individual that is emerged and is acculturated by communities, groups, subgroups, and so on, and is also beholden to the upkeep of common good, common infrastructure, and so on. So we have a necessary paradox it's certainly the modern West, of maintaining some kind of mixture of an autonomous individual and yet the need for communities that we come from and are beholden to nurturing. And so in thinking about the future, what I've been doing a lot of thinking about is what kind of transcendence or what kind of principles would keep us with a good, a productive, flexible, vibrant mixture of notions of the individual, which is, by the way, what we hang our human rights on. Right? You have certain inalienable rights regardless of who your uncle was or what village in Scotland you came from, etc. That's an inalienable right. That concept of human rights and civil rights hangs on the individual. But we also need communities that, and we obviously come from them, and we need to nurture the common good. And so we need a productive meld between our notions of the individual that has flexibility and has rights, and our notions of community whose infrastructure that we need to be maintained. And I think that's one of the big problems or issues that we have today, and we will be looking at for a while.
Thank you very much.